this video, we're going to show you how to stitch out block 11, and you will also watch this video if you're stitching out block 26. They are basically the same, only orientated and mirrored and all that good stuff. So let's see what we need in order to make this block. Okay, to make block 11 or block 26, you are going to need your hoop scissors, you will need your water-soluble thread and embroidery bobbin thread. If you are putting your backing on the back of your block while it's in the hoop, you also need a piece of backing fabric and also matching bobbins. We have numerous threads listed in our instructions. And so there's my thread. You will need your, let's see, this is your fabric 6, which is going to basically, I'll show you where that goes. Fabric 6 goes right there. You will need 2 pieces of your fabric 7. So here's my 2 pieces. One's a little narrower than the other. And you will need your fabric 3 and your fabric 5. And that's to do the different piecing that we have going on right there. You will also need, and this is optional, your piece of wool, cut the correct size and pressed around the edges. And also you'll need to have your battleizer in the hoop and ready to go. So let's go to the machine and get started. Okay, I have my machine set up with water-soluble thread in the needle and embroidery bobbin thread in the bobbin. Then for step 1, all you're going to do is hit the start button and the machine will sew a placement stitch. Now I'm ready for step 2. This is where you're going to use your optional piece of wool. If you decide that you don't want that extra dimension in your quilt, you can just skip forward to step 3. But for step 2, which is adding the optional wool that's already been prepped and pressed around the edge, then you will place that right inside the placement stitch from step 1 and get it nice and even in there. You will also raise your presser foot to its highest setting, and then you can hit the start button and the machine will sew a zigzag stitch that attaches the wool to the battleizer. You just need to hold the wool in place so the zigzag stitch catches it. For step 3, we again are continuing with our water-soluble thread, and our presser foot is up in a higher position, and we will just sew the pattern of this quilt block right onto the wool. And if you skip the wool, then you're going to be sewing that pattern onto your battleizer. And this is just so we know where to place our fabric. And you will just kind of push the wool down as it's stitching so that the wool does not get caught in the presser foot. Sometimes that tends to happen even if you do have it in its highest position. And you can usually just stop the machine and then just with a little snip, just cut that extra wool that may have gotten hung up out of your presser foot and then carry on. Step 4, we're going to take our fabric 3 and we're going to place it right over this section right here. And I'm going to extend at least a ½ inch into or beyond the block on the outside of the block, and make sure that the place where it's going to be covering is all complete. You have enough fabric that's there. And I'm going to continue with water-soluble thread, and we will sew a tack down stitch. Okay, so now it is time to trim that fabric that we just tacked down. Anything on the outside of the block, you will go ahead and leave that there. If there's a seam on the inside of the block, and there is, we are going to cut that about a scant ¼ inch using our hoop scissors. And then anywhere on the circled, the curved area, you're going to cut that to a scant ⅛ inch. in this section here, I have a little tiny piece of fabric that's going to be pieced down here. So I'm going to cut that a scant 1/8 of an inch, and your instructions will tell you all that. And it's all written down in your instructions and also in your slideshow. For step 5, you're going to put just a neutral colored sewing thread in your needle. You're still going to have embroidery bobbin thread in the bobbin. And for step 5, you're going to need your fabric 5, and it's such a small area that we're going to be piecing in the little corner right here, that if you just have a scrap, that would be a lot easier to work with than the entire strip. So you're just going to place fabric 5 right sides down, raw edges even with that little corner, and let the machine sew the seam. Step 6, you're going to take your little scrap of fabric 5 and you're going to flip it so it's right side up, and you'll smooth it out and finger press that tiny little seam. You can actually finger press all the way across there if you want to, and then you're going to let the machine sew a tack down stitch. So now I'm going to trim this fabric that I just flipped. And on the bottom curved edge here for block 11, I'm going to trim that so that there is basically about a scant 1/8 of an inch left of the fabric. And that will then be covered up by satin stitch later, so it won't even show. Any fabric that is on the outside of the block, you can leave it there unless it is kind of an extreme amount and you want to maybe cut a little bit away. So we are ready for step 7. Step 7, we're going to continue with fabric 5, but we're going to use a strip of it rather than a scrap. So on this step, you're going to lay it so that it's right sides down, raw edges even, and equal amount at the top and bottom of that curved area. And then with a neutral thread, you're going to stitch a seam. We are on step 8. So for step 8, you're going to take your fabric, you're going to flip it right side up, and smooth it out and finger press that seam. And then the machine will sew a tack down stitch to hold it in place. And then to trim this piece, you're going to trim this diagonal line, which is on the inside of that curved area. You're going to trim that to a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. And on the bottom of the arch area, you're going to trim that to a scant 1/8 of an inch. All right, so I have my fabric 5 all trimmed. And now I need my fabric 3 strip, and I'm going to place it right sides down, raw edges even from the previous piece of fabric, and the machine will sew the seam. Now the next 8 or 9 steps are basically going to be the same repetitive steps. You're going to sew a seam, flip the fabric, smooth it out, finger press it, and it sews a tack down. You trim it and you do another seam. So you're basically stitch and flipping to fill this area. So I'm going to just speed forward and not record that, but I'll come in probably around the end of step 18 and I'll show you how to do the last, almost the last part of this arch. So here is my seam. Okay, we have completed through step 16, and after you do step 16 and you have your fabric down, this happens to be the piece of fabric right here for this piecing that runs right along this longer piece of dark green that we have going through here. But it's the same type of trimming. You're going to trim still a scant 1/4 of an inch here, and also a scant 1/4 of an inch here, and then a scant 1/8 of an inch at the top and the bottom. I'm going to go ahead and do that now, and then we're going to go to step 18 where we can add our final little piece on this side of that dark green that is going to complete part of our little arch circle here. So let me just trim this real quick so you can see it. I'm going to trim the little peak here at the point down to a scant 1/8 of an inch, and we should be all set for the next step. For step 17, I have my fabric 3, right sides down, raw edges even right here, and we sew a seam. Step 18, we're going to flip this fabric right side up and smooth it out, and we're going to finger press the seam, and it will sew a tack down stitch. And then anywhere inside that arched area, I'm going to trim it to a scant 1/4 of an inch and a scant 1/8 of an inch up at the top of the arch. For step 19, we're going to do the tack down for this purple piece of fabric here. This is our fabric 3. So I have changed to water-soluble thread because a little bit of that is on the outside edge. And by changing to water-soluble thread, once you get the blocks sewn together, if that happens to be peeking out in your seam allowance, you don't have to get your seam ripper out to get rid of that. You just get it wet, or it'll just dissolve when you put it in the washing machine on a gentle cycle. So I'm going to go ahead and grab my new piece of my fabric 3, and I'm going to place it right over that section right there. So let me find the best way to do that. I'm going to make sure that I'm at least a 1/4 of an inch in, or scant 1/4 inch on that dark green section that will stitch out. And you can always trim it later, so always be a little bit more generous, and make sure that entire section is being covered. And then using the water-soluble thread, it will sew our tack down for us. Just hold the fabric smooth, make sure it doesn't move. And then for trimming this, adjust the camera a little bit again. For trimming this, you're going to trim it a scant 1/4 inch, anything that is on the inside here. That's where that dark green longer piece will end up going. Anything again along the top of the arch, we were trimming a scant 1/8 of an inch. And along this side right here, we are going to be piecing another piece of fabric, so that is also going to make it a scant 1/4 inch of an inch because it is a seam allowance there. So we are all set for the next step. Step 20, you will need your fabric 5, and you will place it right sides down, raw edges even, with the last piece of fabric. So I will lay it in place right there. Right side down, raw edges even. I put neutral thread in the needle, still have embroidery bobbin thread in the bobbin, and we will let the machine sew the seam. For step 21, we're going to flip the fabric, smooth it out, and finger press it. I'm also going to switch back to water-soluble thread, since again it is stitching on the edge of the block. Alright, so I'm going to trim anything, of course, on the curved edge to a scant 1/8 of an inch. Anything that is going to be another seam, which is going to be this tiny area right in here, I'm going to trim that to a scant 1/4 of an inch. And then anything on the outside of the block, I will just leave there. Step 22, I am back to neutral thread and the needle. I found a spot I need to trim here to a scant 1/4 inch. You're gonna need a little scrap of your fabric 3. So here's my little scrap, and it's gonna go right side down, raw edges even, right here. And then the machine will sew the seam using that neutral thread. Step 23, I have put water-soluble thread in the needle only. And again, that is because it's going to be stitching on the edge of your block. And we don't want that stitching to show once you get it sewn together. So I'm going to smooth out this, flip the fabric, smooth it out and finger press it, and sew the tack down with water-soluble thread. Okay, step 24 is one other little tiny area that requires a seam. So I have my fabric 5, and I'm going to place it right side down with the raw edges even after I trim the previous fabric to a scant 1/4 inch. And the machine will sew a little seam, very little seam. And then I will flip the fabric, finger press it, and sew a tack down using the water-soluble thread. Okay, so here we go. We're going to flip that fabric. And I have water-soluble thread in the needle, and we're going to finger press it. And the final tack down for that arched area. So to trim this final little tiny piece of fabric that we put there, again, it's a scant 1/8 inch along the curved edge. And anything on the outside of the block, you can leave at least a 1/2 inch there. Step 26, you're going to take your smaller or narrower piece of fabric 7, and it's going to lay right over the bottom edge of that arched area, bottom edge on block 11, and you're just going to center it so that it is completely covered. And just check on all the different sides. You should have approximately 1/2 inch of fabric that'll be left at the bottom. And then with the water-soluble thread, we're going to sew the tack down stitch. And you're just going to hold your fabric in place. Areas where we're going to cut close, it's going to stitch a double row of stitching. Now it's going to do the same thing over on the other side. Once we have our fabric 7 stitched down, we are going to trim close to the stitching right along this area on both sides. There is a section here that will have a different darker piece of fabric that'll be tacked down. So in the meantime, you can trim this a 1/4 inch. Anything on the outside of the block, we're going to go ahead and leave that there. So I'm going to use my little hoop scissors mini. I will trim fabric on the top curved edge here on my block 11, right close to stitching, and inside here I'll leave about a scant 1/4 inch for our seam allowance. Step 27, we're basically going to do the same thing but only at the top of the block. So I have my fabric 7 and I'm going to lay it right side up and making sure that I have sufficiently covered the top of the arch. And I have equal amounts of fabric on all sides, and with my water-soluble thread we're going to go ahead and sew a tack down stitch. It's going going to sew a triple run line stitch along here. It's a more secure stitch that is in lieu of a double line of straight stitching, and that gives us something to cut against that if we happen to cut close to stitching and we snip into a stitch, there will be another stitch left there. And so just keep the fabric nice and smooth so there's no puckers when you get around to the beginning. You will also do the same thing over on the other side to complete the tack down for fabric 7. Okay, now again we are going to trim right close to the stitching, right there. Anything on the outside of the block, we're just going to leave it in place. This is our hoop scissors mini that I'm cutting with. This area, which is the point of our next fabric we're going to tack down, you can trim that to a scant 1/8 of an inch. Another little piece out. You may have a little bit of fabric remaining, but it's such a tiny area that we're just going to leave it, and it will be covered up with our fabric here on our next step. And for step 28, we are going to continue with our water-soluble thread. We are going to need a strip of, forgot the number, a strip of fabric 6. And we're going to lay it right side up, right over this area right here, just like so. And I like to peek underneath to make sure I have everything covered sufficiently. And it all looks wonderful. So we will sew a tack down stitch using water-soluble thread. It's doing a double line of stitching, so that should be a tip off that you will be trimming close to the stitching on both sides of this fabric. Okay, I just finished trimming this close to the stitching. And I put thread in my needle that matches my fabric 3, and it's going to sew satin stitch along top and bottom or left and right of the arch, depending on if you're doing block 11 or block 26. And it'll also do like a decorative zigzag inside this piece of fabric, forget the number, the dark green that we did in our last step. So I'm all threaded up and I'm ready to go, so let's go. Step 30, you'll put thread in the needle only that matches your fabric 6, which is this long skinny point right there, and you'll just hit the start button and it'll sew the satin stitches and some little quilting inside that area. Step 31 is where you're going to add your backing fabric if you choose to do it while it's still in the hoop. Remember, there are 2 options. You can add your backing fabric to the back of your hoop while it's still stitching and finishing the quilting part, or you can add it in sections at the end and then stitch in the ditch once you have your quilt all layered. So I'm going to show you the first option. I'm not going to actually follow through with it because I chose the second. But the first option would be if you are adding the backing fabric while your block is still in the hoop, you will just simply take your hoop off the machine but leave the design inside the hoop. And then you will take your backing fabric. And it's just an example, so it won't be perfect. You're going to lay your backing fabric centered over the block. So you'll peek underneath, make sure it's centered correctly, and can do that in both directions. And then with water soluble thread in the needle only on this step, it'll sew a tack down stitch to attach this to the back of your hoop. Now, if you are, like I said, if you're doing the option that I'm going to do, where I'm going to sew my blocks together in sections and then one big piece and stitch in the ditch to cover that, then you will just skip this step. Some of the blocks in this quilt, they tell you to sew this step anyway, and that is because sometimes there are areas that maybe do not have that basting stitch completely around the edge. But this block is basted along the edge in all those areas, so I'm going to skip this step. But I'm also going to instruct you what to do if once you start doing the quilting part. One of the important things to do is you're going to have to match your bobbin thread with your needle thread for your quilting because you want it to look pretty on the back. The other thing that you're going to have to do is if your machine has an automatic thread cutter, you're going to want to turn that off. And the reason is because sometimes you'll end up with the thread bunching or nesting on the back of your block, and you don't really want that. And then the other thing you're going to need to do is before you hit that start button to begin sewing the quilting portions, you're going to want to bring that bobbin thread up through the top of the block and hold onto the thread and hit the start button. And then you can stop it and trim those threads. That also keeps the back looking nice and clean. So those are a few tips for you to follow if you're adding your backing fabric on the back. So my next step is I'm going to put some thread in the needle only because don't have the back on. I hope this isn't confusing for you. But if you do have the back on, you're going to match your needle and bobbin thread, and then you're just going to hit the start button and begin sewing. So I am on step 32, and that is you're going to put thread in the needle that matches your fabric 7. If you did put your backing fabric underneath on the back of the hoop, then you're going to also want to match that bobbin thread. And don't forget to turn your automatic thread cutter off. And if you do have the backing on, you're also going to do a needle down, a needle up, and you are going to bring that bobbin thread to the top, and you're just going to hold it while it begins to sew. Let it take a few stitches, and then you can go ahead and trim both pieces of thread. Now, if you're doing it like me and adding your backing fabric and by sewing your blocks together by section, adding the backing fabric later, you can just hit the start button and you don't have to worry about a matching bobbin or bringing the bobbin thread to the top. Step 33, you're going to put thread in the needle that matches your fabric 5, and for me it's this green. And don't forget, if you have your backing fabric on, you're going to also match your bobbin thread. Since I don't, I can go ahead and hit the start button and it'll begin sewing some quilting. Step 34, you're going to put the thread color of your choice, and this is the step that sews out like the flower area and that. Different blocks of the quilt, so you're going to have to make sure that you're consistent, use the same thread color on the matching blocks that are doing the same step. So I'm just going to hit the start button since I don't have my backing fabric on there. But if you did, remember you would also do a needle down and a needle up to bring that bobbin thread to the top, and that will help with any bird's nests on the back. Okay, so my block 11 is finished, and so I'm going to take it out of the hoop. And again, this is basically block 26 and 11 are pretty much the same. Orientation is a little bit different, but all the steps are the same. So just a reminder too that when you take it out of the hoop, maybe up in the seam allowance if you have your backing fabric on it, or just on the back of it somewhere, like towards the top of how it comes out of the hoop. write the block number on it, because otherwise you'll end up with a puzzle that may take you days to solve, and it's always good to know the location of each block. So this block, along with many others, is in the center of the quilt, so meaning there's no binding sewn to any edge. So basically what you're going to do is you're going to take your Trimmer by George, the metal edge of it on all four sides, and you're just going to shimmy this right up against underneath the fabric on the front, and then you're going to put the metal edge there and put it down. Do a gentle tug and make sure there's no fabric showing right here. And then you're going to use a 60mm rotary cutter, and you're going to cut away all the bulk from the seam allowance. So if you have backing fabric on there, your backing fabric will go away, your banalizer will go away, so that the only thing left is just the fabric on the front. So I will do one more side. So you're just gonna shimmy that right up in there, lay it down flat, give it a very gentle tug, and that helps get that metal edge as close to the basting stitch as possible. And then with the 60mm rotary cutter, you can cut off the excess, and you'll do that to the other two sides as well. And here is my completed block 11, another one. This is what it looks like on the front, because then you'll cut all the fabric that is on the front, you'll cut to 1/4 inch. And this is what the back of it looks like when you are going to add the backing fabric later. If you have your backing fabric on here, you will still see all this exposed, because the backing fabric and the batting will also be gone. So that's how you trim these blocks. So that wraps up the video for blocks 11 and blocks 26, and we hope you enjoyed making this as much as we have, and we'll see you next time. Bye.